Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, D.C., with the pleasure of speaking to distinguished scholar Allen Hertzke with an important new book on religious liberty, always a timely topic, but especially so now. So, Allen, thank you so much for being available for this conversation, and please tell us what this book is about.
All right, very good. Well, thank you for hosting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to get the word out. I often note that what really motivated me in completing this arduous task, frankly, of trying to synthesize global scholarship on why religious freedom is so important to an array of aspects of human life, that when you meet people, as I have, who have been tortured, exiled, or even enslaved for their faith, it creates a profound sense of moral obligation to use your voice. And my voice is my scholarship. So the title of the book is Why Religious Freedom Matters: Human Rights and Human Flourishing. This is the cover of the book that will be coming out 1st of April. And if you will allow me, I'll just read or recite the very first paragraph of the book. Imagine a social force, a potent X factor that underpins democracy, bolsters civil liberties, builds citizen loyalty, undermines religious fanaticism, reduces societal violence, improves women's status, fosters economic development, spurs uplift for the poor, and nurtures international peace. And as I note in the book, it seems almost unbelievable that religious freedom is linked to all of these outcomes. But in fact, that's what really sophisticated new global research is telling us, that religious freedom is a profound, powerful human right that does all of these things. Not alone, of course. Other factors are involved. But religious freedom really is a powerful X factor for the kind of flourishing global future we would seek. So that's the essence of the argument. And one way one might think about this would be to say that the research I marshal primarily tell us how religious freedom is linked to these various outcomes, to democracy, human rights, uplift for the poor, economic flourishing, women's empowerment and peace. And the research is fascinating. And if you have particular questions, I'd be happy to chat about that. But every chapter, in a sense, contains some new research based upon global data or careful case studies or ethnographies that show unusual ways that religious freedom promotes these human goods. And so let me give you just one example. Women's empowerment. To some skeptics, it would seem that religion, because it is seemingly a religious traditional religion, would seem to be patriarchal and traditional and so forth, that would not be empowering of women. But that confuses traditional religion with religious freedom, because religious freedom entails the right to criticize one's own faith, to exit, to create forms of faith communities that serve your needs. And when women in developing societies, poor women in developing societies, are able to exercise agency in religion, it leads to agency in economics and in family relations and all sorts of other arenas. It empowers them and actually leads to tangible improvements in their outcomes. And we have some great scholarship from but I'm trying to remember. I'm having one of those moments, one of those moments pulling up a name.
Well, it'll come to you.
Rebecca Shaw has some great research on this, for example, and has actually seen visibly the improvements in women's status when they are able to exercise religious agency. It always seems that in each chapter there's a really interesting counterintuitive finding about the link between religion and these various outcomes.
And you have been writing on religious freedom issues for 25 years? Has it been that long?
It has been that long because I started research on global religious freedom issues in 1998 as the campaign developed for the International Religious Freedom Act. And I published Freeing God's Children, a book about that movement and the unlikely allies that pressed for that legislation. Came out in 2024. But really, I've been immersed in global networks of scholarship and advocacy on religious freedom since 1998. But really working intensively on kind of a synthesis of global scholarship for the past decade. And so I'm much relieved that the book is going to come out.
So the world has changed dramatically since 1998. And in 1998, at least in America, there seemed to have been there's the outward appearances of a broad consensus behind religious freedom internationally and domestically. That consensus no longer exists. Have we lost ground on religious freedom in America and around the world over the last quarter century?
Well, one of the things that enabled this book, I could not have done this book 2 decades ago because we didn't have means of actually measuring the status of religious freedom in every country on earth. But with Pew's restrictions reports and other major global databases, we're actually at this sort of liminal moment where we can measure the status. And all of the great databases show that for the past 2 decades, the status of religious freedom has declined. More countries are harassing more religious groups than 2 decades ago. More people are living in regimes of repression. In fact, Brian Grimm, who developed one of the ways of measuring restrictions on religion, finds that in the last decade and a half or so, that 1 billion more people are living in regimes where their religion is being repressed or their practice is harassed and so forth. So just in terms of global measures, we have seen a significant decline in the status of religious freedom around the world and in our own society, both by governments and hostile social actors. So we've seen more violence against religious communities, Jews, Sikhs, Christians, Muslims. We've seen Black Christians. We've seen more government harassment or restrictions in some cases, depending upon the administration. So while most people and most politicians say they believe in religious freedom, its status is under great peril.
And internationally, religious freedom, the greatest setbacks have been in China, presumably.
Yes, it's very the key, you might say, the key places where religious freedom has seen a great setback are in the communist remnant, especially China. Back in 2015, during the relaxed era of Deng Xiaoping and his followers, and those premiers who followed him, there was a more relaxed atmosphere. And there was a de facto kind of more tolerant religious environment. But Xi Jinping has enacted a harsh crackdown and used the most sophisticated surveillance technology to crack down on believers, making it very difficult. And of course, even a genocidal campaign against the Muslim Uyghur population. But another major source of repression, in fact, are regimes that are guided by either theocratic leaders, especially Iran, Saudi Arabia, places like that, or religious nationalists, such as in Burma or Myanmar, where the government and the dominant religious community are fused. And one of the findings that I think is most important is what one scholar called the paradox of privilege, that whenever the dominant majority in a society becomes deeply privileged by the state or by political power, it tends to become more violent, more repressive, less itself as a religion. So you have the specter of Buddhist monks actually participating in violence against non-Buddhists in Burma, and where you would think that would not be possible with a religion such as Buddhism. But we see that with all religious communities, where religious nationalists have either seized power or exercise enormous influence over the state, or the state co-opts them for its own purposes, such as Putin in Russia. So we can almost mark the period in Russia when religious freedom began to decline with a passage of a religious law that privileged the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, and harassed religious minorities. And so he could count on a rather supine, co-opted Orthodox Church to parrot his justification for the war against Ukraine. And so I think that's one of the most important findings of the book, is that beware of privilege, beware of being co-opted by the state as a religious community. And that includes Christianity.
And that pertains to India.
Definitely pertains to India. We see the Hindu nationalists becoming more emboldened by the patronage of the state of the Hindu Nationalist Party in India. And in fact, one of the great scholars, Nilay Saya, that I draw upon heavily, notes that, and he was even surprised by this finding. He's written 2 books on religious violence, and he found that 90% of all the religious violence in the world is perpetrated not by religious minorities, taking arms against their oppressors, but by emboldened religious majorities who feel empowered to enact mob violence against religious minorities or dissenters within their own communities and so forth. And so I think that's a really important finding, that the paradox of privilege, or I would call it the curse of privilege.
Now, before I interrupted, you were going to speak about Christians and
yes,
the United States. It seems to me that there is, well, as mentioned this earlier, a less of a consensus in America about less interest in international religious freedom, and a much more often parochial interest. We're interested in solidarity with overseas persecuted Christians, but not with anybody else. Is that your impression?
Yeah, that is the impression I get. I think there was a moment during the campaign for the International Religious Freedom Act in which people joined together with religious others, people they wouldn't necessarily share theology or beliefs with, in a common cause. But I do think we're seeing a more parochial attitude. But also, I think the culture wars in America has not been good for the cause of global religious freedom, or for religious freedom more generally, if it's seen as a partisan cause or backed by particular groups that want privileges for themselves. So I would say that is a really serious concern right now.
Before we close, what is your advice for restoring the near consensus that we enjoyed back in 1998 and for several years afterwards?
Right. I think that my own calling, I had a sense of calling about this book, because when I started actually with a team at Georgetown University. They brought together some of the top scholars in political science, economics, history, sociology, and law. And as those projects came in, as those papers came in, I was struck by how powerful religious freedom was as a force for good in the world. And I think that is the message, that even if you're not a religious person, you ought to care about religious freedom, because it helps to contribute to the kind of democratic, peaceful, flourishing world we all hope for. And so my hope is that as we begin to see how important religious freedom is to human flourishing, that we can begin to build that sense of common cause again. That would be my hope.
Or, well, I'll ask you one more question before I
That.
let you go. There are persons in American Christianity advocating for essentially an end to the First Amendment and wanting some kind of religious establishment, whether it's integralists who are Catholic or self-identified confessional state advocates who sometimes call themselves Christian nationalists. This is
Right.
very new, just in the last 5 years or
Yes.
so. I'm sure you didn't see that happening 20 years ago.
No,
Does it
no.
concern you, or is this just a blip or a fad that will
Oh,
mercifully
it
pass?
it concerns me greatly. I'm a Catholic Christian, and but I'm also a scholar who has seen the data. And the worst thing that could happen to the Catholic Church in America is if Catholic integralists were able to gain great privileges from government. It's a curse. It actually results in the faith being less authentic and in losing membership. We actually have global data on Christianity that wherever it's favored by the state, or even to the degree it's favored by the state, in other words, as it's favored by the state to greater degrees, it's losing membership.
Mm.
So I'm concerned both in terms of the impact of Christian nationalists or Catholic integralists from the standpoint of democracy, but more importantly, from the standpoint of Christianity. You know, Christianity, to me, the essential message is uncompromising love versus coercion, universal dignity versus exclusion, forgiveness versus retribution. But what you see among the Christian nationalists and others is drives for coercion, exclusion, and retribution. Hardly a winsome picture of the Christian message. And so for me, the greatest threat is to the faith itself.
Well, hopefully, some of these integralists and Christian nationalists will read your book and change their mind and help usher in a new age of appreciation for religious freedom for all. Allen Hertzke, a distinguished retired professor at University of Oklahoma. Could you hold up your book one more time?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Here we go. Can you all see it there?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you, Allen, for a great
Hey,
conversation.
thank you for giving me this opportunity. I appreciate your work.